The smell of grandmother's kitchen lingers in the yellowed pages of old cookbooks. These forgotten recipes tell stories of hard times, when families stretched every penny and used creativity to fight hunger. Today, we journey through 25 forgotten 1970s budget dinners that fed generations during the stagflation, oil embargoes, factory closures, gas shortage, and economic struggles. These aren't just recipes. They're survival stories, passed down through families who knew that with enough ingenuity, no one would go hungry. Shipwreck casserole. During the lean years of the 1970s, when factory workers across the Midwest faced layoffs and households operated on one income stretched impossibly thin, casseroles became the architecture of survival. Shipwreck was born from the end-of-week pantry, the night before payday when the refrigerator had more air than food. The recipe couldn't be simpler. Layer raw potatoes sliced thin across the bottom of a baking dish. Add a layer of sliced onions. Then raw ground beef broken apart by hand. Then a layer of dry rice. Then kidney beans from the can. And pour a tin of tomato soup mixed with water over the whole tower. Cover tightly with foil and bake until everything softens and melds into something unified and filling. Children who grew up eating shipwreck on Friday nights rarely understood why their mothers looked so tired when they made it. It was, to them, a favorite. To their parents, it was a quiet miracle of having almost nothing become enough. Mock chop suey. The word mock told you everything you needed to know about the economy of the household that made it. During the 1970s, Chinese-American cooking had entered the American consciousness through takeout windows and television. But for working-class families, the real thing remained out of reach. Mock chop suey borrowed the idea without the ingredients, substituting hamburger for any exotic protein and canned vegetables for fresh, assembling the spirit of the dish with what the budget allowed. Brown ground beef with onions in a heavy skillet until the meat loses its pink. Add celery chopped into pieces, canned bean sprouts drained and rinsed, and a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with water. Let the whole thing simmer until the celery softens and the sauce thickens. Serve it over rice or egg noodles. Season with soy sauce, a bottle of which many families kept on the shelf long after they'd forgotten why they bought it. Chinese immigrants had brought true chop suey to America generations earlier as their own act of culinary survival, stretching ingredients for hungry railroad workers. In the 1970s, a new generation of working families unknowingly honored that tradition of resourceful cooking with their own humble variation. Creamed eggs and asparagus. For families fortunate enough to have backyard gardens, spring brought the annual miracle of asparagus pushing up through soil that had frozen just weeks before. When meat became too expensive to anchor every dinner, eggs carried the protein. Farm families and anyone with a small garden plot knew that asparagus arrived in abundance and briefly, and that hard-boiled eggs from a backyard flock cost almost nothing. Together, they made something that felt, if you squinted, like a proper dinner. Hard-boil eggs until firm, peel them, and slice them in half. Make a white sauce by melting butter, whisking in flour, and slowly pouring in warm milk until it thickens into something smooth and pale and creamy. Season it with salt and a pinch of nutmeg. Lay the asparagus spears, steamed until just tender, across a piece of toast or over rice, and spoon the eggs and cream sauce over the top. In Pennsylvania Dutch communities across the Mid-Atlantic, this dish appeared every spring on tables where economy and garden abundance intersected. Grandmothers who had cooked through the Depression recognized it as luxury, not scarcity, and served it with quiet pride. Pork chop and rice bake. Some dinners have the rare quality of looking like more than they are. During the hard economic turns of the mid-1970s, when the price of beef climbed beyond what many weekly budgets could sustain, pork remained the working family's protein. A single pork chop per person, stretched by rice and broth baked beneath it, could transform 4 thin chops into a table-filling meal. Season the pork chops with salt and pepper, and brown them quickly in a hot skillet until they color on both sides. Lay dry rice in the bottom of a baking dish and pour seasoned broth or a can of onion soup over it. Nestle the chops on top, cover tightly, and bake until the rice absorbs all the liquid and the pork becomes tender enough to pull apart with a fork. The fat from the chops bastes the rice beneath as it cooks, lending it a richness that belied the poverty of the pantry. Children believed this was company food. Parents knew better, but served it with a dignity that made the children's version of the truth. Chipped beef casserole. Creamed chipped beef on toast had fed soldiers and Depression-era families for decades. By the 1970s, it had evolved into the casserole version, a heartier act of survival dressed up in a baking dish. When fresh meat disappeared from the weekly grocery list, canned and dried beef remained. It kept indefinitely, cost little, and with enough white sauce and starch around it, could pass as a real dinner on even the tightest payday week. Factory workers in Ohio and Pennsylvania recognized this dish on sight and knew, without saying so, that times were lean. Make a thick white sauce in a large pot, melting butter, adding flour, then warm milk, stirring until the whole thing becomes smooth and heavy. Stir in the chipped beef, torn into pieces, along with cooked egg noodles or diced cooked potatoes. Pour everything into a greased baking dish, top with crushed crackers or breadcrumbs for texture, and bake until bubbling and golden at the edges. Nothing went to waste in a household that made this casserole. The stale crackers on top, the leftover noodles, the last scraping of dried beef from the jar, all found purpose here. Honest cooking for honest times. Haystack supper. Church suppers in the 1970s needed to feed crowds on budgets that barely existed, and Haystack was the answer that filled every plate. In Midwestern communities, particularly among church congregations, where frugality was both economic necessity and moral virtue, Haystack supper became the great equalizer. Nobody knew whose family had nothing in the refrigerator and whose had chosen this dish freely. Everyone piled their plates the same way, and everyone left full. The base was plain rice or crushed crackers spread across the plate. Then came a ladle full of loose, seasoned ground beef or chili, followed by canned chili beans, shredded cheese, canned corn, diced tomatoes, shredded lettuce, and whatever else the potluck table offered. Toppings arrived in small bowls passed hand to hand down the table, and each person built their own tower, their own haystack, according to what they liked or what their family had contributed. Nobody admitted which family had brought only the lettuce and which had brought the meat. The anonymity was the grace. Church suppers in the 1970s held communities together in ways that no amount of social policy ever managed. Beef heart stew. Of all the budget meals from the 1970s, this one asked the most of the family that made it, and gave the most back in return. During hard times, the working-class tradition of nose-to-tail eating wasn't philosophy, it was necessity. When beef roasts and steaks sat behind a price tag that matched a week's rent, the heart remained affordable. Butchers who served factory workers and coal mining communities across Appalachia kept organ meats in stock because their customers knew how to use them. Trim the beef heart of its fat and fibrous tissue, cube it, and brown the pieces in a heavy pot with oil until deeply colored. Add onions, carrots, potatoes, and celery, then cover with broth or water and let the whole thing simmer for hours until the meat becomes tender and the vegetables soften into the dark, rich broth. Season with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. Serve in deep bowls with bread for soaking. In coal mining towns across Appalachia, this stew appeared on tables where men came home with black hands and hollow eyes, and needed something that would hold them through the next day's labor. It did. Survival sometimes requires asking the most of the least expensive thing in the case. Creamed tuna and peas over rice. The can of tuna in the pantry was the 1970s household's emergency reserve, the backup plan when nothing else remained. Tuna cost less per pound of protein than almost anything else in the grocery store, and canned peas kept on the shelf for months without worry. Together, they formed the simplest possible cream sauce dinner, appearing on American tables from Maine to California every time the weekly budget reached its end before the week did. Open the can of tuna and drain it well. Make a white sauce by melting butter, whisking in flour, and adding warm milk until it bubbles and thickens. Stir in the tuna, breaking it apart into the sauce, and add a drained can of peas. Season with salt, a squeeze of lemon if you had one, and a pinch of dried dill. Spoon the whole pale, creamy mixture over a mound of rice and serve it quickly while the sauce is still smooth and the steam still rises. Children often preferred this meal to far more expensive ones. The mild tuna and sweet peas and creamy sauce combining into something genuinely comforting. Parents who served it from necessity never corrected this impression. That was kindness in its most practical form. American chop suey. Unlike its mock cousin, this one made no pretense at imitating anything foreign. It was purely, unapologetically American. Macaroni, ground beef, tomato, and whatever was on sale. By the 1970s, American chop suey had been feeding New England families for 2 generations. In school cafeterias from Connecticut to Maine, it appeared on trays every Tuesday. In the homes of factory workers and textile mill employees, it appeared on tables every time the grocery money ran short, which in that decade was often. Brown ground beef with onions and garlic until the fat renders and the meat colors. Add a can of diced tomatoes, a can of tomato sauce, and dry elbow macaroni directly into the pot, along with enough water to cook the pasta in the sauce itself. Let it all simmer together, stirring occasionally, until the macaroni swells and absorbs the tomato, and the whole pot thickens into something hearty and red and filling. Scandinavian immigrant families across the Midwest called it goulash. Italian families in New England called it pasta e carne. Everyone else just called it dinner. The same dish wore many names across many communities, all of them meaning the same thing: enough for tonight. Hot Dish Supreme. In Minnesota, North Dakota, and the upper Midwest, the hot dish was not a recipe, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about what the pantry held and how much it could be stretched. During the 1970s recession, when factory closures hit Midwestern manufacturing towns hard, the hot dish became something closer to sacred. Church cookbooks published then show page after page of variations, each family contributing their particular method, each one a quiet record of how little a household needed to make a full pan. Layer cooked egg noodles or rice in the bottom of a greased baking dish. Add a mixture of browned ground beef or whatever protein remained, canned cream of mushroom soup thinned with milk, and a bag of frozen mixed vegetables poured in straight from the freezer. Top with crushed potato chips or dried breadcrumbs. Cover with foil and bake until bubbling throughout. Remove the foil for the last 10 minutes to brown the top. Nothing went to waste in a hot dish kitchen. Last night's leftover potatoes, a half bag of frozen corn, the end of a can of soup. Everything found its place in the baking dish, and everything came out the other side as a complete meal. That transformation felt, to the families who depended on it, like a small daily miracle. Salmon wiggle on rice. The name made children laugh, which was perhaps part of the point. Canned salmon was cheaper than tuna in some parts of the country, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where salmon remained culturally central even as economic pressures tightened. Salmon wiggle, a cream sauce dish built around canned salmon and peas, appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks of the era and in handwritten recipe cards passed between neighbors who swapped survival strategies the way other generations swapped garden seeds. Drain a can of salmon, removing the bones and skin if preferred, though many cooks left the soft bones in for the calcium they provided. Make a cream sauce, melting butter, adding flour, and stirring in warm milk until thick and smooth. Fold in the salmon and a drained can of peas and let the sauce warm everything through until the peas turn bright and the salmon breaks into flakes throughout the pale, creamy mixture. Serve over white rice. The name made children ask questions, which led to conversations, which led to the kind of table talk that kept families connected through hard times. Sometimes the best thing a recipe could do was make people laugh before they ate. Poor man's lobster. When lobster became the food of restaurants and the wealthy, fishing families along the New England coast discovered that monkfish, the ugly, wide-mouthed bottom dweller that washed up in nets alongside everything else, had dense white flesh that cooked with a texture remarkably close to lobster tail. Fishermen had been throwing it back for years. During the 1970s, necessity reversed that habit. Cut monkfish or shark into thick chunks and simmer them in salted water or court bouillon until just cooked through. The flesh should be firm and slightly resistant, dense in a way that lighter fish never manage. Melt butter in a small pan until it foams and turns faintly golden. Squeeze in a little lemon if available, and serve the fish alongside it for dipping. Nothing more. In coastal communities from Maine to Massachusetts, working families ate what the ocean gave generously and left the expensive catches for the restaurants. Today, chefs rediscover monkfish for upscale menus and charge accordingly. But the families who invented poor man's lobster knew its worth long before the culinary world did. Frankfurter Spectacular. Calling it spectacular transformed the humble hot dog from a ballpark snack into a dinner centerpiece, a piece of verbal magic that cost nothing but accomplished a great deal at the table. During the 1970s, hot dogs remained one of the cheapest proteins available, and American families ate them in more ways than the grill and bun combination the food is remembered for today. Slice frankfurters into coins and brown them in a skillet until the cut edges curl and sizzle and deepen in color. Add sliced onions and bell pepper and let them soften in the fat. Pour in a can of baked beans or make a quick sauce with ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar. Then let the whole thing bubble together until thick and glossy. Serve over rice or egg noodles or with cornbread torn apart and laid alongside. Children loved the Frankfurter in any form, which made this one of the merciful recipes, a dinner that required no persuasion and left no arguments. Parents who served it from necessity appreciated the cooperation. In a decade of limited choices, a meal everyone ate without complaint was its own kind of abundance. Noodles and kraut. Not every budget dinner came from a casserole dish or a cream sauce. Some came from a crock of sauerkraut and a bag of egg noodles. German and Eastern European immigrant families who had settled across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the Midwest during the previous century carried food traditions that happened to be perfectly suited to the economic pressures of the 1970s. Sauerkraut, kept without refrigeration, cost almost nothing, and provided a sharp, acidic counterpoint to the blandness of plain noodles in a way that made the dish feel complete. Cook egg noodles until tender. Drain them and toss them in a hot skillet with butter until the edges take on a little color. Add a generous portion of sauerkraut, drained slightly but still tangy and wet, and toss the two together over medium heat until the kraut warms through and the noodles absorb some of its sour liquid. Season with caraway seeds if they were in the spice drawer, and with black pepper, always. Families who had eaten this dish for generations didn't think of it as poverty food. It was simply Tuesday. But for neighbors who adopted the recipe during leaner years, it became the discovery that necessity makes of unfamiliar cuisines, a new solution dressed in someone else's tradition. Cowboy beans and Franks. Across the American Southwest and in rural communities throughout the South, dried pinto beans and Frankfurters formed one of the most filling, most economical combinations available. Ranch hands and farm families had known this for decades. During the 1970s, when beef prices spiked and ground meat became a luxury, the bean and Frank combination fed households across economic and regional lines. Soak dried pinto beans overnight, then cook them low and slow in water with a ham hock or a few strips of bacon until they become tender and their liquid thickens. In the last hour, add sliced Frankfurters, diced onion, a can of tomatoes, chili powder, cumin, and a splash of molasses or brown sugar to balance the heat. Let everything simmer together until the beans absorb all the flavors and the sauce darkens. Farm families in Texas and Oklahoma who had grown up eating beans as the backbone of every meal found themselves in good company during the 1970s as working families from very different backgrounds arrived at the same conclusion. Beans feed more people for less money than anything else in the store. City chicken. City chicken is made from cubed pork and veal threaded onto small wooden skewers, breaded, and cooked until the fat renders and the outside crisps. The name came from earlier decades when chicken was expensive and city dwellers couldn't keep backyard flocks. By the 1970s, the irony had reversed. Chicken had become affordable and veal scarce, but the recipe and its name persisted in Polish and Ukrainian communities across Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. Thread alternating cubes of pork shoulder and veal onto wooden skewers, season with salt and pepper, dredge in flour, dip in beaten egg, and roll in breadcrumbs. Brown the skewers in a heavy pan with oil until golden on all sides, then transfer them to a baking dish. Add a small amount of broth, cover tightly, and braise in the oven until the meat becomes tender and the breadcrumb crust takes on a deeper color. In Pittsburgh neighborhoods where steel workers and their families had maintained these Central European traditions for generations, city chicken appeared at Sunday dinners and holiday tables alike. Younger generations sometimes needed to be told there was no chicken in it. The older ones just smiled. Creamed salmon on toast. Cutting toast on the diagonal and calling the resulting triangles points transformed a meal built from pantry scraps into something that suggested intention and care. During the 1970s, when women who had once expected more from dinner had learned to make peace with less, these small acts of presentation mattered enormously. They were a form of dignity expressed in the kitchen. Open a can of salmon, drain it, and remove the skin, leaving the soft bones for those who wanted them. Make a cream sauce, the reliable butter-flour-milk combination that underpinned so many of these budget meals, and fold the salmon in gently so it breaks into large, tender flakes throughout the pale sauce. Season with lemon juice, salt, and a touch of dry dill or parsley. Toast bread slices until firm, cut them corner to corner, and arrange the triangles on a plate before ladling the creamed salmon over them. In New England households, where thrift had always been considered a virtue rather than a symptom, creamed salmon on toast points appeared without apology. It was, by any honest measure, a respectable dinner. Sometimes the presentation is the whole truth of the thing. Spanish noodles. American cooks of the mid-20th century applied the word Spanish to anything that contained tomatoes, peppers, and onions, a culinary shorthand that had very little to do with the Iberian Peninsula and everything to do with making a plain dish sound more interesting. Spanish noodles were simply egg noodles, baked in a tomato-pepper sauce with ground beef, but the name gave them an air of occasion that the ingredients alone could not quite manage. Brown ground beef with onions and bell peppers until the vegetables soften and the meat colors. Add a can of tomato soup or crushed tomatoes. Season with salt, pepper, and a little chili powder or paprika, and let it simmer until the sauce thickens slightly. Cook egg noodles separately until just done. Then combine them with the meat sauce in a baking dish. Top with a sprinkle of grated cheese, and bake until the cheese melts and the edges bubble. In factory towns across the Midwest during the 1970s, this dish appeared in community cookbooks and on mimeographed church supper lists with the frequency of a heartbeat. It was the backup plan, the reliable answer to the question of what to make when the week had already taken everything else.